Alright everyone, it's time for Occult Literature, video number 269, Frays Golden Recipes. This is a 66-page work, so it's on the short to intermediate side, but it's quite dense. It's also alphabetized. It's a funny little work, and I'll get a little bit into the evolution behind this kind of work as well, because that's something that some bibliophiles might be intrigued by. Link in the description of my edition of this work on Amazon. Second and third links are to my books blogs. If you like this sort of miscellany slash folk remedy sort of thing, there are other works there, like Homan's Powwows, which is under the grimoire header actually, because it does contain like prayers and incantations, but also many of the works under the herbal header. This is essentially one part herbal medicine and one part domestic tip guide, with a few asides, the meanderings into behavioral science and so forth, which make it even more intriguing. Again, alphabetized, quite dense, usually fairly short little passages. This kind of work is the direct offshoot of the grimoire. See, what happens is this. In the era of the Enlightenment, or you'd say the late Renaissance Enlightenment, or into the early 19th century, the public, for the first time, there was a burgeoning group within the public that was literate. They were able to read. And this is reflected in the change in magical works from the earlier grimoires of maybe the 1600s into the form that it was then in. And you have a lot of things that are rebranded for a more peasant audience. And so instead of it talking about making seals in gold and alabaster and fine linen cloth and stuff, you get things that are more root work. They're more peasant-y. They're more low class, essentially. They are the people's magic. The folk magic, actually. The magic of the Volk. And what you get, therefore, are things that are more simple. They're usually a lot cheaper. They're sometimes there's some inside jokes, like with the Petit Albert. You'd think of some of the stuff in there about mandrakes, and it's very funny. What ends up happening is that over time, therefore, the older grimoires were pure magic. It was just a bunch of prayers and high magical rituals and talismans and things. In that era, things then, they become more geared towards medicine, livestock, animal husbandry, tips and tricks for the home, making dyes, making soap, candles and things. Little skilled things, like if you've ever read Foxfire, you might think of a more modern, oddly enough, offshoot of a grimoire. This particular kind of work emerges later on, and it's almost completely divorced of that initial spiritual context. So you have the 100% spiritual context, nearly, of the early grimoires. Then you have sort of a mashup, a bric-a-brac era, late 1600s through the Enlightenment, through the early 1800s, really. Then you have this kind of book, which is more a domestic book, and actually the concept of a recipe book, if you know anything about the word recipe, is a direct takeoff of receipt. It's sort of the same apothecarian and tips and tricks books, and what would happen is families would have their own book. If you've ever heard about the little black books of Scandinavia, Iceland, and Northern Europe, essentially they were domestic books. They were filled with spells and incantations and tips and tricks and little things that the family sort of understood to be its family knowledge. And so you'd get spells alongside healing charms and poultices. This sort of work is more of a standardization of that basic theme and taking those same very simple recipes for healing and other purposes, putting them in a book and then publishing them. Now, Frays Golden Recipes had an extremely long run. If you read this one, it claims several 100,000 copies sold up to that particular time, which is entirely possible since it's probably dates to the mid-19th century initially. And then actually, I've seen editions, scans of it that go into the middle of the 1910s. Now, this is a work from the 1890s, so it was printed a number of times in that same period. It's probably quite popular. As far as the actual herbal content goes, it's fairly standard. It's like, for headache, take this herb. Chew the root of this plant and you will feel better. And that's sort of what you get. These sort of herbal remedies are even in vogue today. Of course, the recipe books now are entirely about domestic tips and cooking and things like that, and don't even have the folk medicine usually. That split off. The evolution of this particular literary tradition, I'm interested in tracing that and thinking about it sort of the same way as the guides, the fortune tellers, oracles, and dream interpretation core of work. You see a divergence over time. Cooking becomes its own genre. The domestic tips and sort of miscellany becomes a genre, or at least a sort of a collection of subgenres. And then you get the more magical side and the folk medicine split off as well. Frays Golden Recipes is a very good work. Highly recommended if you go through this. Now, I removed some of the like the testimonials at the end I got rid of because they're pointless. Honestly, it was just self-aggrandizing sort of bullshit. And this was also common. This sort of work as well, usually at the end, and this work did, it would have a little ledger where it would tell you the prices of herbs in some shop owned by the person who wrote the book, or a mail service by this time, which is the case with Frays Golden Recipes. And the idea was that you sent the book out. So local businesses, they'd stock the book, people would read it, then they'd order your apothecary and remedies. I've seen this in so many works, and it doesn't even matter whether they were more mainstream. This appears to be more of a mainstream popular work or something that was very, very obscure and local, because I've read works like that too, like the What Do Your Neighbors Say Dream book. That one that was literally linked to one hospital where they electrified everything and had like, what was it, chambers filled with ozone and weird shit. It's like Frankenstein. Very interesting topic. Anyway, again, link in the description of my edition of this work on Amazon. Highly recommended if you're into herbal medicine, anything about this sort of miscellany in between the earlier Enlightenment sort of folk peasant grimoires and the modern era. Second and third links to my books blog. So if you're interested in this, you should probably peruse both the grimoires and for powwows and some of these works, as well as the herbal header. That's about all. Peace out.